The year was 1987, and Vivian Hartley was finally home. After 5 years in Hollywood, the 32-year-old actress had returned to Crescent Bay, the small coastal town where she grew up. She wasn't running from failure. In fact, she'd done pretty well for herself. Her face had been on movie posters. She'd walked red carpets. Critics called her the next big thing after her breakout role in a horror film that became a cult classic almost overnight. But Hollywood had a way of eating people alive, and Vivian was tired of being consumed. The parties, the fakeness, the constant pressure to be someone she wasn't. She wanted simplicity. She wanted to wake up to the sound of ocean waves instead of traffic. She wanted to be just Vivian again, not some version of herself created for cameras and magazine covers. So she came back to Crescent Bay and rented a small cottage on the edge of town. It was nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms with peeling paint and a porch that creaked when you walked on it. But it had a view of the ocean, and that was enough. Her neighbors were kind, normal people who treated her like anyone else. The local grocery store owner didn't ask for autographs. The mailman didn't care that she'd once shared the screen with famous actors. Life was quiet, and for the first time in years, Vivian could breathe. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was a sweet elderly woman who lived alone in the house next door. She'd bring over fresh cookies and they'd sit on Vivian's porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Mrs. Patterson never pried into Vivian's past, never asked why someone with her success would give it all up for a sleepy town where nothing ever happened. But something was happening, something Vivian couldn't talk about, not even to kind Mrs. Patterson. October arrived with its usual fog and chill. The lighthouse on the cliff overlooking the ocean had been abandoned for years, but locals still used it as a landmark. Kids would dare each other to go near it at night. Couples would park nearby to watch the waves crash against the rocks below. It was just part of the town's landscape, as normal as the old church or the diner on Main Street. On a Thursday evening, October 15th to be exact, Vivian seemed different. Mrs. Patterson noticed it when she saw her rushing to her car. There was tension in her shoulders, worry in her eyes. She was dressed in jeans and a dark jacket, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Everything all right, dear?" Mrs. Patterson called from her garden where she'd been pulling weeds. Vivian stopped and turned, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, yes. Just meeting someone up by the lighthouse. I'll be back by morning." "By morning? That's awfully late for a meeting." "It's important," Vivian said, her voice quiet. "Someone needs to know something. Something that can't wait." Mrs. Patterson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. "Be careful up there. Those cliffs are dangerous, especially in the fog." "I will, promise." Vivian waved and got into her car, a blue sedan she'd bought used when she first moved back. The engine started with its usual sputter, and she drove off toward the north end of town, toward the lighthouse. That was the last time anyone saw Vivian Hartley alive. When she didn't come home the next morning, Mrs. Patterson wasn't immediately worried. Maybe the meeting ran late. Maybe she stayed with a friend. But by noon, when Vivian's car was found abandoned near the lighthouse, worry turned to fear. The police arrived quickly. In a town as small as Crescent Bay, a missing person was serious business. Chief Rodriguez led the investigation himself. He was a good man, thorough and dedicated, someone who actually cared about the people in his town. The scene at the lighthouse didn't make sense. Vivian's car was parked about 50 feet from the cliff edge, right where the old access road ended. The driver's side door was unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition, just hanging there like she'd meant to come right back. No signs of a struggle. No broken glass or torn fabric. Nothing that screamed danger, but Vivian was gone. Inside the car, they found her purse on the passenger seat. Her wallet was there with cash and credit cards. Her driver's license smiled up at them from behind plastic. Everything a person would need, just sitting there waiting for her return. Back at the cottage, things got stranger. Police found a suitcase on her bed, half-packed. Clothes folded neatly. Toiletries gathered on the dresser like she'd been preparing for a trip. But where, and why leave without it? Then they found the photograph. It was torn, ripped right down the middle like someone had done it in anger or fear. The piece they recovered showed Vivian standing next to a man in an expensive suit. He was older, probably in his 50s, with silver hair and a confident smile. Local business owner William Thornton. Everyone in town knew him. He owned half the commercial properties in Crescent Bay and had connections that reached far beyond their small town. Next to the photograph was a note, written in Vivian's handwriting on a piece of notebook paper. Just one sentence, but it was enough to make the investigation take a dark turn. They can't know the truth. Who couldn't know? What truth? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Chief Rodriguez brought William Thornton in for questioning. The businessman seemed genuinely shocked by Vivian's disappearance. He admitted they'd been friends, said she'd come to him for advice about some business matters when she first moved back. But that was months ago. He hadn't seen her in weeks. And the night she disappeared? He was at a charity dinner with 200 witnesses. His alibi was airtight. Search teams combed the cliffs and the beach below. They brought in dogs. They had volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder through the brush. Divers checked the waters, fighting against currents that had claimed lives before. Days turned into weeks. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence of what happened to Vivian Hartley. The townspeople had theories. Some said she'd gotten too close to the edge and fallen. The fog that night had been thick, the kind that makes you lose your sense of direction. Maybe it was a terrible accident. Others whispered about foul play. That photograph, that note, they suggested something darker. Maybe she knew something dangerous. Maybe someone wanted her silent. A few thought she'd staged the whole thing, that she'd walked away from her life again like she'd done with Hollywood. But those who knew her really knew her didn't believe that. Vivian wasn't running anymore. She'd found her peace in Crescent Bay. As winter approached and the case grew cold, the mystery of Vivian Hartley's disappearance settled over the town like a heavy blanket. The lighthouse stood on its cliff, keeping whatever secrets the fog had swallowed that October night. And somewhere someone knew exactly what happened to the actress who came home looking for peace, only to vanish into thin air. Time has a strange way of turning tragedy into legend. What starts as raw grief and desperate searches eventually becomes something else. A story people tell. A mystery that defines a place. That's exactly what happened to Crescent Bay and the disappearance of Vivian Hartley. The first year after she vanished was the hardest. Her younger sister Claire refused to accept that Vivian was gone. While others started to move on, Claire doubled down. She plastered missing person posters on every telephone pole in 3 counties. She called the police station so often that the officers recognized her voice before she even said her name. She hired a private investigator, then another when the first 2 came up empty. Claire's husband tried to be supportive, but the obsession was taking its toll on their marriage. Her kids grew up with a mother who was physically present but mentally somewhere else, always chasing the ghost of an aunt most of them barely remembered. But Claire couldn't stop. Vivian was her big sister, the one who'd braided her hair before school, who'd taught her to swim, who'd sent postcards from Hollywood with little hearts drawn in the corners. By 1990, the official search had been called off. There was simply nowhere left to look. The case remained open, but active investigation stopped. Chief Rodriguez retired in 1995, and on his last day he told a reporter that the Hartley case was the one that would haunt him forever. He'd done everything by the book, followed every lead, but sometimes that just wasn't enough. The 90s brought a new kind of attention to Vivian's story. True crime was becoming entertainment. Television shows started picking up cold cases, and Vivian's disappearance fit perfectly. Beautiful actress, mysterious circumstances, a small town with secrets. It had all the ingredients. Claire appeared on 3 different programs between 1994 and 1998. Each time, she'd sit in front of the cameras with Vivian's high school photo, her voice breaking as she begged anyone with information to come forward. The shows brought tips, dozens of them. People swore they'd seen Vivian in Oregon, in Mexico, in Canada. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every spark of hope got snuffed out. Mrs. Patterson, Vivian's elderly neighbor, gave her last interview in 2015, just weeks before she passed away at the age of 91. By then, she was in a nursing home, her memory foggy on most things but crystal clear about that October night. She told the local newspaper something she'd never mentioned before. She'd seen a black sedan parked down the street that evening, idling with its lights off. She remembered thinking it was odd but didn't make the connection until years later. She never got close enough to see who was inside or get a license plate number. Just a black car that didn't belong in the neighborhood, waiting for something or someone. The detail was too little, too late, but it added another layer to the mystery. Had someone been watching Vivian? Was the meeting at the lighthouse a trap? William Thornton, the businessman from the torn photograph, died in 2003 from a heart attack. He'd maintained his innocence until the end, but rumors followed him to his grave. Some people in town never quite believed his alibi, no matter how many witnesses confirmed it. At his funeral, someone spray-painted, "What did you know?" on the side of his office building. The graffiti was cleaned up, but the question lingered. The cottage where Vivian had lived became something of a shrine. Claire couldn't bring herself to sell it or rent it out. She paid the property taxes every year and visited once a month to clean and maintain it. The furniture stayed exactly as Vivian had left it. The half-packed suitcase remained on the bed, gathering dust. It was like a museum to a life interrupted, frozen in time. Neighborhood kids started telling stories about the cottage being haunted. They'd dare each other to look in the windows at night. Some claimed they saw shadows moving inside, heard piano music even though there was no piano. Of course, it was all imagination and the natural sounds of an old house settling, but the stories persisted. The lighthouse became a tourist attraction, though not the kind anyone felt good about. People would drive up there, take photos, talk about the mystery. Local ghost tour companies added it to their routes. "This is where actress Vivian Hartley was last seen alive," they'd say dramatically, their flashlights sweeping across the foggy cliffs. It felt disrespectful, turning someone's tragedy into entertainment, but that's what happens when enough time passes. Claire aged alongside the mystery. In her 40s, she started a website dedicated to finding Vivian. She learned HTML, taught herself photo editing, spent hours scanning old pictures and documents. The website got thousands of visitors but produced no real leads. She joined support groups for families of missing persons, finding comfort in people who understood the unique pain of not knowing. By the time Claire reached her 60s, her hair had gone silver and her hands shook from early-onset Parkinson's disease. But she never stopped. Every birthday, every holiday, every anniversary of that October night, she made a post on social media. "Still looking? Still hoping? Please share." The posts got fewer likes each year as algorithms changed and people forgot. New families moved to Crescent Bay. Young couples bought houses, started businesses, raised kids who'd never heard of Vivian Hartley. To them, the lighthouse was just a cool old building on a cliff. The cottage on the edge of town was just an empty house that somebody should really do something with. The past had no weight for people who hadn't lived through it, but for the old-timers, the ones who remembered, Vivian's disappearance was a scar on the town's history. They'd talk about it at the diner sometimes, usually late at night when the coffee had gone cold and the conversation had drifted to the passage of time. They'd wonder what really happened. They'd remember where they were when they heard the news. They'd shake their heads and say what a shame it was. Such a beautiful, talented woman gone without a trace. The case files sat in boxes in the police station basement, yellowing and brittle. Occasionally, a new detective would pull them out, read through everything with fresh eyes, and come to the same conclusion as everyone before them. There was simply not enough evidence to solve the case. Without a body, without witnesses, without any physical proof of what happened, it was just guesswork and theories. By 2023, it had been 36 years since Vivian vanished. Claire was 68, living in an assisted care facility because her Parkinson's had progressed to the point where living alone wasn't safe. She still had Vivian's picture on her nightstand. She still believed somewhere deep in her heart that one day she'd know the truth. Most people had accepted they never would. The mystery of Vivian Hartley had become part of Crescent Bay's identity, like the fog that rolled in every evening or the taste of salt in the air. It was just something that was unchangeable and permanent. Nobody could have predicted that nature itself was about to reveal what decades of searching could not. Sometimes the earth keeps secrets, and sometimes, when conditions are just right, it gives them back. March 2024 started like any other month in Crescent Bay. The winter had been mild, and locals were already looking forward to spring, but weather forecasters were tracking something concerning. A massive storm system was building off the Pacific, and it was heading straight for the California coast. The first drops of rain fell on a Tuesday morning. By afternoon, it was coming down in sheets. The kind of rain that makes you question if it'll ever stop. Streets flooded. Storm drains backed up. People rushed to hardware stores for sandbags and tarps. The news kept telling everyone to stay inside, to avoid unnecessary travel, to prepare for the worst. But this was just the beginning. For 3 solid days, the rain hammered Crescent Bay. The ocean churned with waves that crashed against the cliffs with a force nobody had seen before. The sound was deafening, like constant thunder that never ended. Rivers overflowed their banks. Mudslides closed highways. Power went out in sections of town, leaving families huddled by candlelight, listening to the storm rage outside. The old lighthouse stood on its cliff, battered by wind and rain. It had survived storms before, had stood for over 100 years, but this was different. The ground beneath it was saturated, turned into something closer to soup than soil. Water was finding every crack, every weakness in the earth. On the 4th day, around 3 a.m, something gave way. Nobody was there to see it happen. Nobody heard it over the sound of the storm. Tons of earth and rock, loosened by days of relentless rain, simply let go. A massive section of the cliff face slid down to the beach below, taking trees, boulders, and a popular hiking trail with it. When morning came and the rain finally stopped, the damage was obvious. The cliff looked like someone had taken a bite out of it. What had been a gradual slope was now a sheer face of exposed earth and stone. The hiking trail that tourists loved was just gone, erased from existence. The lighthouse itself had survived, but it was now dangerously close to the new edge. The town mobilized quickly. County engineers needed to assess if more of the cliff was at risk, if the lighthouse needed to be evacuated or torn down, if any homes were in danger. It was all hands on deck. Among the volunteers helping with the assessment was a young woman named Kira Lopez. She was 23, a geology student at the State University working on her master's degree. She'd grown up in a town 3 hours south, but had heard about the storm damage and saw an opportunity to study a fresh landslide for her research. Her professor had given her permission to take a week off from classes. Kira arrived at the site on Friday morning with her camera, notebook, and enough equipment to make her look like she knew what she was doing. The county engineers were focused on structural stability, checking if the remaining cliff could support the lighthouse. Kira was more interested in the geological layers now exposed by the slide. She walked along the beach, carefully stepping over debris and fallen rocks. The landslide had exposed earth that hadn't seen daylight in thousands of years. Different colored layers of sediment told the story of ancient seas and shifting continents. It was beautiful in a way most people wouldn't understand. That's when she saw it, something that didn't belong in a natural cliff face. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe her eyes playing tricks after staring at rocks for hours. But as she got closer, there was no mistaking it. Jutting out from the exposed earth about 20 feet up from the beach was concrete. And metal. Definitely man-made. Kira's heart started racing. This could be anything. Old infrastructure from when the lighthouse was built. Maybe a forgotten bunker from World War II. California's coast was full of weird remnants from different eras, but something about it felt significant. She took photos from every angle, then called out to one of the engineers. "Hey, you might want to see this." Within an hour, there were 6 people standing on the beach, all staring up at the anomaly in the cliff face. The lead engineer, a guy named Tom, who'd been doing this work for 20 years, had never seen anything like it. "It looks like some kind of entrance," he said, squinting up at it. "Or maybe a sealed chamber. Is it safe to investigate?" Someone asked. Tom rubbed his chin. "We'd need to stabilize the area first. Make sure nothing else is going to come down. But yeah, we should probably check it out. Could be structural issues we need to know about." The decision was made to bring in specialized equipment. This wasn't something they could just climb up to. The exposed earth was unstable, and one wrong move could trigger another slide. They needed anchors, ropes, proper safety gear. 2 days later, a team was ready. Kira had begged to be included, and they'd agreed to let her observe from a safe distance. She watched as workers carefully secured the area and created a stable platform. Then, with a small excavator modified for delicate work, they began carefully removing earth from around the concrete structure. What they uncovered made everyone go silent. It was definitely a chamber. Old, maybe decades old, carved into the natural cave systems that riddled the cliffs. The entrance had been deliberately sealed with concrete blocks, hidden and forgotten. Whoever put it there didn't want it found. The team leader made the call to open it. Using careful, controlled movements, they broke through the seal. Air that had been trapped for who knows how long rushed out, stale and dead. Someone pointed a high-powered flashlight inside. The beam of light swept across the small space. Old wooden crates, remnants of what might have been rope. And then the light found something that made the person holding the flashlight gasp and step back. Bones. Human bones, still partially clothed in fabric that had somehow survived in the sealed environment. "Stop everything," the team leader said, his voice tight. "We need to call the police. Right now." Within 30 minutes, the beach was swarming with law enforcement. Crime scene tape went up. Detectives arrived from the county office. The state police sent investigators. Word spread through town faster than the storm had rolled in. A body had been found in the cliffs near the lighthouse. After all these years, the clothing was old, clearly from decades ago. Dark jeans, the remnants of what looked like a jacket. And there, glinting in the dirt even after all this time, was a piece of jewelry, a gold locket on a delicate chain, tarnished but intact. One of the detectives carefully retrieved it, handling it like the precious evidence it was. The locket opened with gentle pressure. Inside was a tiny photograph, protected from decay by the sealed metal. The image was small but clear enough. A woman's face smiling at the camera. The detective's hand started to shake slightly. He'd grown up in Crescent Bay. He'd heard the stories his whole life. He knew that face. Everyone in town over a certain age knew that face. "Get me Claire Hartley's contact information," he said quietly to his partner. "I think we just found her sister." The news hit Crescent Bay like a second storm. After 37 years, Vivian Hartley had been found. Not lost in the ocean, not vanished into thin air. Right there, sealed in the cliffs, less than 100 yards from where her car had been found all those years ago. The town that had learned to live with the mystery suddenly had to face the truth. And the truth was going to be much darker than anyone had imagined. The drive to the assisted care facility felt like the longest 20 minutes of Detective Raymond Foster's career. He'd volunteered for this duty because he felt it was right. Claire Hartley deserved to hear the news from someone who understood the weight of it, not from a stranger or worse, from social media. When he arrived, the facility director met him at the entrance. Her face was somber. She already knew why he was there. News traveled fast in small towns, and Crescent Bay was about as small as they came. "She's in the sunroom," the director said softly. "Please be gentle. Her health isn't great." Claire was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, a blanket over her lap despite the warm spring sunshine. At 68, she looked older than her years. The Parkinson's had taken its toll. But when she saw Detective Foster's expression, something changed in her eyes. After 37 years of waiting, she knew. "You found her," Claire said. It wasn't a question. The detective knelt beside her wheelchair so they were at eye level. "Yes, ma'am, we did." "I'm so sorry it took this long." Claire's hands trembled, but not from the disease this time. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and she nodded slowly over and over, like her body didn't know what else to do. "Where?" she whispered. "In the cliffs, near the lighthouse." The landslide exposed a hidden chamber. She was there the whole time, Claire. All these years she was right there. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. Right there. Close enough that search teams had walked past hundreds of times. Hidden so well that 37 years had to pass before nature itself revealed the truth. Claire reached out with a shaking hand and gripped the detective's arm. "Someone put her there. Someone hid my sister. Yes, and we're going to find out who." The FBI took over the investigation within 48 hours. This was now a murder case, and it was clear from the start that it went deeper than anyone had imagined. The forensic team worked carefully, treating the site like the crime scene it was. Every grain of sand, every fragment of evidence could matter after all this time. The medical examiner's report came back within a week. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Vivian hadn't fallen. She hadn't drowned. Someone had struck her with enough force to kill her. The position of her body and the sealed nature of the chamber made it clear this wasn't an accident. It was murder, and it was premeditated. Someone had known about that chamber and used it as a tomb. Investigators descended on Vivian's cottage, treating it like a fresh crime scene even though it had been undisturbed for decades. Claire had kept everything exactly as it was, which turned out to be a blessing. Using modern forensic techniques that didn't exist in 1987, they processed the entire house again. In Vivian's bedroom, behind a row of books on the shelf, they found something that had been missed before. A journal, hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of a thick novel, the kind of hiding spot that made sense for someone who was afraid, someone who needed to keep secrets. The journal entries from the weeks before her disappearance painted a disturbing picture. Vivian had stumbled onto something big. She'd been taking her usual evening walks along the cliffs when she noticed something strange. Boats coming in at odd hours, always at night, always when the fog was thick. Men unloading crates and carrying them through paths that led to the old lighthouse. At first she thought maybe it was fishermen doing their work. But fishermen didn't work in secret. They didn't threaten people who got too curious. One entry described how she'd been followed home after asking questions at the marina. Another talked about seeing the same black car parked near her cottage multiple times. Vivian had been scared but determined. She'd started documenting everything. Times, dates, descriptions of the boats and the men. She'd even managed to take photographs from a distance, though the journal didn't say where she'd hidden them. Most importantly, she'd written about the people involved. And one name appeared again and again. William Thornton, the businessman who died years ago. But he wasn't alone. The journal's final entry, dated October 15, 1987, the day she disappeared, was chilling. Meeting JT tonight at the lighthouse. He says he's with the federal task force investigating the smuggling. Finally, someone who can help. He wants all my evidence. I'm bringing everything. This nightmare will finally be over. I can go back to living my life. Maybe even call Claire tomorrow and tell her I'm okay. I've been such a bad sister keeping all this from her. But after tonight, it'll all be over. JT. The initials sent investigators scrambling through old records. They found him quickly. Jonathan Thornton, William's younger brother. He'd been 42 in 1987, working in the area as a construction contractor. He'd left California in 1989, moved to Arizona, and had been living there ever since. The pieces were coming together. The chamber where Vivian was found wasn't natural. It was part of an old smuggling tunnel system from Prohibition, but it had been modified. Construction work. Jonathan's specialty. He'd known about those tunnels. He'd probably helped seal them off for the smuggling operation. DNA evidence from the chamber, preserved in the sealed environment, told the rest of the story. Modern genetic genealogy technology allowed investigators to match biological evidence to family lines. Jonathan Thornton's DNA was there. But there was another profile, too, belonging to someone else who'd been at that scene. They identified him through family DNA databases. Raymond Garrett, a former Crescent Bay police officer who'd retired in 1998 and died in 2019. He'd been one of the officers who investigated Vivian's disappearance, one of the people trusted to find her. Suddenly, everything made sense. Why the investigation had stalled so quickly. Why certain leads were never followed up. Why the search teams never checked the cliff chambers even though those areas were known to locals. Raymond had been steering the investigation away from the truth all along, protecting himself and his accomplices. The operation had been sophisticated. William Thornton provided the business connections and money. His brother Jonathan provided the physical infrastructure and knowledge of the tunnels. Raymond provided protection and inside information. They'd been smuggling drugs through the lighthouse using the abandoned tunnel system that nobody remembered existed, and Vivian had discovered it all. Not because she was investigating, but because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, taking evening walks, asking innocent questions, being observant in a way that got her killed. The federal agents tracked down Jonathan Thornton in Phoenix, Arizona. He was 79 years old now, living in a retirement community, playing golf twice a week and volunteering at his local church. He looked like everybody's grandfather. Harmless, kind, the type of person you'd trust with your life. When they arrested him, he didn't resist. He didn't even seem surprised. As they put him in handcuffs, one of the agents noticed something. The old man was crying. "I knew it would come someday," Jonathan said quietly. 37 years. I thought maybe I'd die first. Maybe I wouldn't have to face it. But you can't run from something like this forever. In the interrogation room, faced with forensic evidence that hadn't existed in his era, Jonathan Thornton confessed. Not because he wanted to, but because denial was pointless. Science had caught up with his crime. He told them everything. How Vivian had contacted him thinking he was a federal agent. How he'd met her at the lighthouse that night. How he'd tried to convince her to forget what she'd seen, but she'd refused. She had evidence. She was going to the real authorities. "My brother told me to handle it," Jonathan said, his voice hollow. "Make the problem disappear." That's what he said. Make it disappear. So I did. Raymond Garrett had been there too, making sure no evidence was left behind, helping seal the chamber. Together, they'd erased Vivian Hartley from the world, or so they thought. They'd taken her car back near the lighthouse to make it look like she'd parked there. They'd gone through her cottage taking the photographs and evidence she'd mentioned in her journal. They'd thought they'd covered everything, but they'd missed the journal itself, hidden too well in its clever spot. And they could never have predicted that decades later, a storm would expose what they'd buried. The confession made headlines across the country. The case that had baffled investigators for nearly 4 decades was finally solved. But for Claire, sitting in her wheelchair at the facility watching the news, it wasn't about closure or justice yet. It was about grief, finally allowed to be real. Her sister hadn't left her, hadn't abandoned their family. She'd been stolen, murdered for trying to do the right thing. The truth was finally out. But the hardest part was still to come. The trial of Jonathan Thornton began on a gray morning in November 2024. The courthouse in the county seat was packed with people who'd waited nearly 4 decades for this moment. Reporters lined the hallways. Camera crews fought for position outside. But inside courtroom 3 there was only silence as the bailiff called everyone to order. Jonathan sat at the defense table looking smaller than his 79 years. His expensive lawyers had advised him to take a plea deal. Second-degree murder, they said. With his age and health issues, he'd likely die before serving his full sentence. But the prosecution wanted to go to trial. They wanted the whole story told in public. They wanted everyone to know what had happened to Vivian Hartley. Claire was there every single day, wheelchair positioned in the front row behind the prosecution. Her daughter sat beside her, holding her hand. The tremors from Parkinson's made Claire's whole body shake sometimes, but she never looked away from the man who'd killed her sister. Not once. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA, the journal entries, the confession that Jonathan had given, thinking somehow it would make things better. His lawyers tried to argue diminished capacity, that he'd been coerced by his older brother, that he'd lived with guilt for 37 years. The jury didn't buy it. During the trial, prosecutors revealed just how deep the corruption had gone. The smuggling operation had run for nearly 3 years before Vivian discovered it. Thousands of pounds of drugs had come through that lighthouse, distributed across California and beyond. The money involved was staggering. William Thornton had been a respected businessman on the surface, but underneath, he'd been running a criminal empire. Raymond Garrett's family released a statement through their lawyer. They were horrified by what he'd done. They'd never suspected. Looking back, they remembered he'd been different after 1987, quieter, drank more, had nightmares. They'd thought it was just the stress of the job. Now they understood it was guilt eating him alive from the inside. The trial lasted 3 weeks. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, there was no celebration in the courtroom. How could there be? It had taken 37 years. The main players were dead or dying. Justice felt less like victory and more like finally closing a wound that had been left open too long. The judge sentenced Jonathan Thornton to 25 years to life. Everyone knew he'd never see freedom again. As they led him away, he stopped and turned to look at Claire. For a moment, their eyes met across the courtroom. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Claire didn't respond. What could she say to the man who'd stolen her sister? Who'd let her spend 37 years searching, hoping, never knowing? Sorry didn't begin to cover it. But that night, alone in her room at the care facility, Claire cried. Not tears of anger this time, but something else. Relief, maybe. Or exhaustion. The fight that had consumed her entire adult life was finally over. Vivian had been found. Her killer was behind bars. The truth was out. The question now was what came next. The funeral took place on a Saturday in December as the year drew to a close. Vivian Hartley was finally laid to rest in the town cemetery, in a plot next to where their parents were buried. The whole town showed up. People who'd never met Vivian came anyway, drawn by a story that had defined Crescent Bay for so long. Claire had chosen a simple headstone. Vivian's name, her birth and death dates, and just one line underneath. She tried to do the right thing. No flowery words. No dramatic statements. Just the truth of who Vivian had been and why she'd died. At the service, Claire insisted on speaking even though her voice was weak, and her words came slowly because of her condition. Her daughter helped her stand, supported her while she faced the crowd. "My sister was brave," Claire said, her voice carrying in the quiet cemetery. She saw something wrong and she tried to stop it. That's who Vivian was. She wasn't just an actress or a pretty face in a movie. She was someone who cared about doing what was right even when it was dangerous, even when it cost her everything. She paused, gathering strength. For 37 years I looked for her. People thought I was crazy, obsessed, maybe I was. But I couldn't let her be forgotten. I couldn't let her just disappear like she never mattered. And now finally she can rest. We both can. There wasn't a dry eye in that cemetery. After the funeral, Claire made a decision. The cottage where Vivian had lived would be transformed. She donated it to a nonprofit organization that helped families of missing persons. They renovated it, turned it into a resource center where people could come for support, information, and hope. A place where families like hers could find help instead of facing the nightmare alone. The center opened in March 2025, exactly 1 year after the landslide that changed everything. They called it Vivian's house. Inside, Vivian's story was told through photographs and news clippings and the journal entries that had helped solve her case. But more importantly, it was a working center with counselors, investigators who volunteered their time, and support groups that met weekly. Kira Lopez, the geology student who'd first spotted the anomaly in the cliff, graduated with her master's degree and immediately got hired by the FBI's Forensic Geology Unit. Her thesis about how natural disasters can expose hidden crimes became required reading in her field. She visited Vivian's house on opening day and placed a small rock from the landslide site in a display case, a reminder that sometimes truth finds its own way out. The lighthouse on the cliff got a new purpose too. The county stabilized it and turned it into a memorial and education center about smuggling history and the importance of speaking up when you see wrongdoing. Vivian's story anchored the exhibit. They installed a plaque near where her car had been found all those years ago, in memory of Vivian Hartley, who lost her life fighting for what was right. May we all have her courage to speak truth in the face of danger. Claire lived to see all of this happen. Her health declined through 2025, but she held on long enough to cut the ribbon at Vivian's house, to see her sister's legacy become something positive, something that helped people. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in August 2025, just 3 months after her 69th birthday. Her family found comfort in knowing she'd finally gotten the answers she'd searched for her whole adult life. At her funeral, they buried her next to Vivian, reuniting the sisters at last. The story could have ended there, but life has a way of continuing even after the credits roll. Vivian's house helped find 3 missing persons in its first year of operation. Tips that came through the center's hotline led to arrests in 2 cold cases. The support groups gave comfort to dozens of families going through what Claire had endured. On the first anniversary of the center's opening, a ceremony was held on the beach below the lighthouse. 100 people stood in the sand, looking up at the cliff face where nature had finally revealed what men had tried to hide forever. A local high school student, chosen to speak on behalf of her generation, read a statement she'd written. "We didn't know Vivian Hartley. We weren't alive when she disappeared. But her story teaches us that truth matters, that speaking up matters even when it's hard, even when it's scary." She didn't stay silent, and because of her courage, a criminal operation was eventually brought down. It took too long. Justice came too late for her. But it came because she refused to look away from wrong. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky,